All right, let's get started. My name is Sasha Rosenbaum, and this conversation is about survival of the most open, or the Microsoft journey to open source. Немного обо мне. Я в оригинале из Днепропетровска, но я живу и работаю в Америке уже много лет, поэтому говорить буду в дальнейшем по-английски. So, like I said, my name is Sasha Rosenbaum. I started my career as a developer, and then I worked in operations. I worked as an architect for Microsoft for a number of years, and now I work as a product manager for GitHub. So this story is about Microsoft's journey, and it also includes GitHub, and this is how I'm presenting it to you today. So let's get started with a little bit of history before Microsoft had the cool, colorful logo like this. It was before Microsoft actually had any colors in the logo, and it was mostly about ASCII characters on the screen. So back in those days, actually, Microsoft did not like open source very much. So famously, Bill Gates said, there's this thing called the GPL, which we disagree with, right? And Steve Ballmer actually went a little bit further and said Linux is a cancer. And Microsoft was known to talk about how they don't like open source, and open source is actually stealing software, and they don't want open source to spread out. But fast forward a couple of decades, and what we see is actually a very different approach. So Brad Smith was saying this in last year Ignite, if I remember correctly. So basically that Microsoft was on the wrong side of history. And then Satya Nadella, the new CEO, stands on stage in front of slides of Microsoft loves Linux, and that used to surprise a lot of people, right? So how did we come all the way here? Well, this was a journey on a number of years. So I think the first pivot began in 2014 when Satya actually first used the slogan, Microsoft loves Linux, Microsoft loves open source, right? And so we created the .NET Foundation back that year, and we created basically the Microsoft organization on GitHub. And that was kind of the first baby steps to embracing open source. Then in 2015, notably, Visual Studio Code was released. So kind of moving towards an open source IDE from the paid and lockdown version. Then in 2016, we released .NET Core, released PowerShell Core, and Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation, which again was kind of a lot of surprising news for a lot of folks. Lots of things that happened in 2017. I love the sequel 2017 on Linux, and the fact that the code for the Windows OS actually moved to Git from TFVC, which was again a big milestone, big step. And then Visual Studio in 2018, Visual Studio Code was actually ranked the top developer tool on the planet, which again in the 4 short years. And the conjecture is that if it wasn't open source and available and distributed on any system, this wouldn't have happened, and definitely wouldn't have happened that quickly. And then in 2018, Microsoft also acquired GitHub, which is how I'm standing right here talking to you right now. And then we had roughly 5,000 Microsoft employees contributing to open source. In 2019, that number rose to 25,000 Microsoft employees contributed to open source projects on GitHub, and about 9,000 open source projects inside of Microsoft org on GitHub. So lots of things happening there. And I'll add another column here for 2020 in the end of the year. But this journey wasn't sort of easy to embrace. So let's talk a little bit about the steps that the company sort of went through while embracing open source. So this is roughly broken into 7 steps. So let's talk about step 1 first, consuming open source responsibly. So the question that I want to ask you, and I wish I could see y'all, is how much do you really rely on open source? sometimes when I talk to large enterprises, I actually get an answer that they don't use open source at all, right? Or I get an answer that they use it a little bit, maybe here and there, but usually not, right? But we know from software composition reports that this is not true. Actually, 99% of all organizations on the planet make extensive use of open source. 90% of application development leverages open source software. So if you look at a pie chart of all the code that goes into your app, only a tiny slice of it is actually your business logic, is your new code. And the rest of it comes from your open source dependencies, which is kind of mind-blowing. And then again, this is the reason that Microsoft made the pivot and actually decided to embrace open source, because you can either close your eyes and say this is not happening, or you can go with the flow and embrace the new cool thing. But this also means that you have lots of dependencies in your application, that some of which you might not even know about, right? You have a huge dependency tree, and you can't necessarily look at every single dependency every single day. And this also means that sometimes people break in through backdoors and through vulnerable packages that, again, you as a developer, as a security officer, have to keep track of. And that's not necessarily easy. We know, and this number is from 2014, so I actually need to update the stats from a new report, but 99% of vulnerabilities in 2014 were exploited more than a year after the vulnerability was known. So after the CVE was published, there was a year when it wasn't remediated, wasn't upgraded, vulnerable dependency wasn't removed, and then the breach happened because of that. So we know that we're doing pretty bad on a security front here. So if I take a metaphor for this, I like the house metaphor. So imagine that you basically built a huge mansion, you installed all the newest appliances, you bought all the most expensive furniture, and you just kind of didn't think about putting doors in, right? Not alone locks, but you don't even you're like, doors, windows, that can come later. So this is basically the approach we take to security a lot of times today, and we actually need to think about this some more and be more responsible in how we consume open source dependencies. We also know from various reports that it's much cheaper to remediate a potential vulnerability. The closer to the developer cycle you get, the cheaper it gets, right? If you get all the way to the right, where your software has been breached, it's actually going to cost you millions. And I've seen it happen, and it's really, really not pretty. And if you can remediate a potential vulnerability in development, it's going to cost you just a few hundreds of dollars, or maybe even less than $100. So in GitHub, we actually think about these problems a lot. And so we've started releasing security features. So basically, there are three main pillars that we look at. We look at secret scanning, we look at code scanning, and we look at software supply chain. So the supply chain is the only thing I'm going to talk about through this presentation, because I think it's really important. It kind of ties into consuming open source responsibly. So we have acquired Dependabot last year, which allows you to basically upgrade your dependencies automatically. So basically, it identifies if any of your dependencies in that whole graph, in the whole dependency tree, anywhere, were identified as vulnerable. And in case of a security vulnerability, it actually also suggests a pull request, so you can upgrade the dependency without spending a lot of time on it. So I'm actually going to play a little demo video of this. So basically here, you can notice that if you go to security tab in your repository, you will now notice Dependabot alerts, and it's got an ability to basically identify a vulnerable package that I had in here, right? It tells me which CVE it is attached to, which version is vulnerable, which is the first version that was patched. And it actually also, if I go to my pull request, it has also submitted automatically a pull request to bump the version to a non-vulnerable version, right? And then I can go and review the pull request. I can run all my test suite to make sure that it passes, and I can just merge it. So the really nice and exciting news is that if we look at the way that people interact with the Penabot, we see that it actually resolves both rate and speed of them resolving vulnerable dependencies. So that's good news. We are making security more automated and easier to do, and we're making it easier for folks to consume open source responsibly. Now, the other thing, so this is an important life lesson, and it also applies to open source. In terms of consuming open source responsibly, it's important to remember to not be a jerk. Sometimes I see big companies coming in and consuming free software and actually being very demanding of the maintainers. So it's important to remember that maintainers don't owe you anything. They're working for free. They're working for the community. They're trying to provide a service, and they're actually spending their free time in a lot of cases just providing software to folks. So just remember when you are asking them for bug fixes or for features that the responsible thing to do is A, to ask nicely, and B, to maybe contribute to their efforts. So in addition to contributing code, which we're going to talk about some more in a second, we also released a feature that allows you to actually subsidize the projects that you want. So you can sponsor the projects and basically be a GitHub sponsor. GitHub collects no fees for this effort. So basically your money goes directly into sponsoring your favorite projects so you can support the maintainers. And we basically, so what we saw when we released this feature is that a lot of folks go and sponsor the top projects. So what I would advise is kind of find the projects that you like, right? Maybe there's someone in your region or someone that's doing something that's close and dear to your heart, like, you know, fighting with a disease of some sorts or something like that, creating open software to fight COVID or whatever it is. So we can contribute to the projects that are meaningful to us and support the maintainers. So this is a short overview of the consuming open source responsibly. Then let's go into step 2, which is understanding the business value of open source. So first advice in here is that actually you shouldn't fork. So we see it sometimes when companies take open source products and they fork it and they consume it internally and they start kind of building out their own version. So that is just integration debt. That's this technical debt that you're introducing. The responsible thing to do is to contribute back to the communities. And we do see that a lot of companies are now kind of embracing that mindset and doing more and more to contribute back to the community, which is, again, how Microsoft now has 25,000 engineers contributing to open source repositories, right? Because we understand that it's important to give back to the community. So open source communities value code more than talk, right? So again, being demanding is not very helpful to them. So we can look at the open source contribution funnel. So if we walk through this process, actually most people, and that's like 99.9% of all people, will just consume your software. So if you have an open source project, 99% of people will just fork it or download the package and move on, right? Then there are some folks who are going to contribute time to your project. So they're going to contribute logging bugs, or they will add documentation, stuff like that. Then the tiny subset of that population is actually going to go to contributing code to that project, right? And then the really, really tiny subset is going to actually become a maintainer. So that's where they start influencing the project direction. That's where they become actual contributors who are a core part of your community. So I'm going to tell you a story about this, and this is about year 2012. So Team Foundation Server, which you might be familiar with, was basically in the Gartner Magic Quadrant leadership for application lifecycle management, right? This is what we called it back then. And Microsoft basically was leading the way in terms of managing version control and things like that, and kind of, getting a little bit into release management maybe. And then, so this is an excellent book that is helpful to read, but it's Clayton Christensen who talks about the innovator dilemma. Basically, that what he says is that when a new technology disrupts the old technology, it's not because the people who were managing the old technology didn't see it coming or because they were bad managers. What he says is that it's exactly because they were doing the things that they were incentivized to do. So basically, Microsoft options in 2012 were just like, okay, we can ignore distributed version control, right? So TFVC was a centralized version control, and there was Git and Mercurial kind of working on creating a distributed version control system. We could just say, oh, it doesn't matter. It's not gonna become a big thing. Then we could create our own distributed version control system. Now, Microsoft has been known to do such things, and this was definitely a decision that was considered, right? Then we could back Mercurial. Back in the day, at that point, nobody knew if Git was going to win or Mercurial was going to win. And actually, Windows worked better. Mercurial worked better on Windows, right? So that would kind of be a logical decision. And then there was the last option, which was backing Git, right? So Microsoft actually uncharacteristically chose to back Git and actually move slowly but surely move Microsoft projects into Git, because when we moved the Microsoft projects into Git, we actually made sure that we are contributing to that community and that we're making Git better on Windows. So kind of merging that, instead of going against Linux and Git, we went with it, right? And it became sort of a contribution back to the community. Now, in terms of open sourcing your projects, sometimes people ask about this product being open source, that product. This is Microsoft Bob, and people sometimes say, okay, should I open source that, or why is that not being open sourced? Well, so basically there are 3 good reasons to open source a product. One is collaboration. So like the .NET Foundation, .NET Core, we're now getting collaboration from the community, getting new features. We're getting basically feedback on the features that we release, which is a big part of something, right? We're getting earlier adoption, right? Then distribution. It's actually, so when we wanted to give people Visual Studio for free, it was actually not that easy because of the licensing, right? So basically, by open sourcing your product, you are making it available on all the platforms, right? So whatever distribution of Linux can have VS Code because it's licensed permissively. And then compatibility, so it kind of goes hand in hand. You basically making sure that your product will work with different platforms by the community contributing back to you on these compatibility features, and sometimes by you sort of embracing the community and talking to them and understanding that a certain platform is important. Now, there are also bad reasons to open source a product. So basically, the things we hear is, one is PR. So we're going to get a boost for our marketing from open sourcing something. That's kind of not really a good goal, because yes, you will get a boost, but it will not last very long. Then free work. So sometimes people say, oh, this is going to be great. If I open source this product, community is going to, be around it and contribute lots of free work, and I don't have to maintain it anymore. Actually, that's not how it works, and it usually is not what happens. Most open source products do not become very popular, and usually you don't get that much free work. It takes a while and some effort to build the community. Then people also talk about gaining goodwill, kind of in the same bucket. And then people talk about recruitment. So they say, oh, if we open source this, people are going to become familiar and be really good contributors in the future. This does happen sometimes. So, right, if you remember the contribution funnel, people who made it all the way to the top and became maintainers, they're excellent potential hires. But this doesn't happen by itself, right? You have to work and also get lucky for people to get really engaged with your project. So that was understanding the business need. Let's move on to step 3, which is convincing your stakeholders. So in convincing your stakeholders, I would start with your team. So sometimes the main argument why teams don't want to open source something is they're like, oh, we have all this technical debt. We don't want anyone to see our unpretty code, and we're going to fix it, then we're going to open source it. Well, that's a road to this never happening, because the more code you write, the more technical debt you have, and your code will never be perfect. So you can just kind of go with the flow and get over it once you kind of jump into the pool and then learn how to swim, basically. Then you have to convince your management. So, depending on what environment you're in, this may work easily or not so easily. Sometimes it helps you start with convincing your sales. So if you convince your sales team that there's money in open sourcing your product, then they become basically your allies in convincing everybody else, including your senior leadership, right? So you just can kind of follow the money, and that will, once you explain to people that open sourcing a product actually leads to more revenue, then you kind of get everyone on your side. In our case, we were lucky. So Sasha actually understood and led the pivot. So basically, convincing the senior leadership was kind of a no-brainer here. So the next step is also very important. So keeping it legal. So this requires lawyers. You basically need to understand the different types of open source licenses and understand how to comply with them. So if you're leveraging some pieces of other software in your projects, you need to also consult these licenses, and you need to work through all the implications of licensing. You can work with your legal team, and you can work together with them, educate them, and let them educate you, understand your different dependencies and how to open source your product depending on your dependencies. And then don't be afraid of it, right? Yes, it takes a little bit of effort, but basically it is completely possible, and you get to a point where it actually works. And then once you are going through this pain once, you only have to do it once, right? And then my favorite tactic is to ship people swag. So in our case, we gave Microsoft lawyers GitHub swag, and I think that was part of the reason why they were so friendly and work with us so diligently on helping us open source different products. Now, let's move on to the next step, and that is building the community. So let me tell you another story. Basically, in 2015, Microsoft Edge announced that we were adopting Chromium, which is a surprising decision. So I still remember it was built 2015. So, okay, I'm messing the dates up. So built 2015, we actually announced Edge, and then December 2018 was when we were announcing that Edge is adopting Chromium. So I still remember going to build in 2015 and basically hearing that announcement that we're going to build our own engine, right? So Edge was not only a new browser to replace IE, but it was also a new engine that didn't rely on Chromium and didn't rely on Internet Explorer engine. And I remember talking to the product managers on that team, kind of trying to understand their thinking. And it was about basically, holding in and not embracing the community, right? But basically with this new Microsoft, with this new understanding, we understand that this game is essentially not a zero-sum game. So when we build on something that community already leverages, we make the community stronger, and the community makes us stronger. So we don't have to fight against the current, right? We can basically all benefit from building things together. So if you look at the things that .NET went through in terms of getting to open source, basically the first step that we went through was source open. So it's not open source, but it's source open. It's that point in which you put your code out there on the internet and you say, okay, anybody can read your code, right? That's kind of a scary step, but that's the first step into this. Then you basically open design notes and you start talking to the community about how the software is actually built. Then the next step for .NET was actually source open plus limited contributions. So basically, we accepted some contributions from the community. It was kind of difficult to actually go and contribute, but it was possible at that point. Then basically, we adopted the community workflow, which meant that everybody went through the same pull request process, right? So whether you work internally at Microsoft or you worked externally in the community, your pull requests would go through the same tests, through the same code review, through the same process for being merged, right? So this is the true open source. You basically start working collaboratively with your community. And then the next step, and then you could, in theory, start there, but it usually doesn't work this way. So next step is improving documentation. So basically building resources around how people can contribute to your product, right? So there's contributing MD, there's code of conduct, and all sorts of resources that usually come with open source repos. You're building that process out and documenting it so people can jump into your product easily, right? And then eventually you get to the point where actually you have the shared ownership with your community. So your community is with you, like having calls about the product direction, influencing where you're going and things like that, right? So you basically making it a shared ownership and true open source product for your community. So the other important thing is actually to remember to have fun. So we did this, basically, this is just one example. We do these things kind of a lot, but basically we sometimes recognize something that's a meaningful contribution, and we don't even always tell people that this is going to happen, right? Because yes, people will contribute to open source for free t-shirts, but in here what we did was we shipped people with meaningful contributions to .NET, basically a mug that had their commit number on the mug. So basically you could see the meaningful contribution that was recognized and merged into source code. And we did it without warning. So basically just shipped folks some swag they weren't expecting. And lots of folks were excited. And then the other thing that we do sometimes is basically do this stuff where like, this was a cameo in one of the conferences. So basically Scott Guthrie was on stage with that contribution mug. So people who were in the know could recognize that he was also a meaningful contributor to .NET. So basically, when we talk about building a community, we talk about the fact that people are initially contributing because of tangible values, and then they keep coming back for that intangible value, right? For the sense of belonging, for the sense of helping other folks and stuff like that. This, by the way, is another excellent book that is recommended by John Bacon. It's people powered, and it's about building open source and building communities. So that was step 5, being the community, sort of being one and merging with it. Step 6, it is important. So basically, it's important to have some success, right? So we went from, again, basically no open source organizations and Microsoft being very far from contributing to open source to basically having Microsoft VS Code and Microsoft Azure Docs being the top open source projects on GitHub. So this is just GitHub data from I think last year, but basically by the number of contributions and by the number of contributors, Microsoft Azure Docs is actually one of the top organizations, and VS Code is the top one. So this is an incredible journey that you go on, but you can have these metrics and you can look at these things and basically start showing your management or your leadership that these things are really working. And in case of Azure Docs, it's a whole different interesting story about how this, in my opinion, majorly improved the docs, because it used to be that all of our doc writing was internal only, right? And so lots of people would spend lots of time trying to improve MSDN documentation. And this is kind of an uphill battle because you release new features and then you need to keep releasing new docs. Once we open source it, now you can go to docs.microsoft.com and you can basically contribute your own PRs, right? So you can go and say, okay, I think this document is a little bit incorrect and I want to fix the error in the document. And your PR will likely, if it's a good PR, will likely be merged. And I think this just made everything more open and basically allowed us to leverage the power of community to improve our own docs. Now, so this was .NET in 2015, right? And you can see that there's a bunch of different contributions from all over the world, which is pretty exciting when we looked at it back then. But this is .NET in 2020, right? So we basically have contributions from everywhere, including Africa, Australia, anywhere, many places in Asia and stuff like that. I don't think we had contributions from Antarctica. We're going to work on that. Maybe that will improve over time. But basically, this is something that, again, you can show your management and your leadership, and basically they can see that this is a successful thing. Like I said, VS Code, for instance, would never have been such a successful tool in such a widespread tooling community if it wasn't open source and if we didn't allow folks to contribute back to us. And then you have the great unexpected. And sometimes, so we talked about how like expecting free work is not necessarily what you need to do when you open source a project. But what we do have sometimes is those unexpected contributions, and we could go and dig up for many of them. I'll just share one, which comes from David Fowler on .NET Core. So basically, David Fowler and his team are some of the smartest people in the industry, and they're working on ASP.NET Core, and they just got a contribution from someone somewhere in the world that basically allowed the core to speed up by like a millisecond. And none of them were familiar with the kind of technology that powered that commit. So basically, they just got to improve the product for everyone in the world by that unexpected contribution. So that's kind of a very exciting part of this, which is you get people who are maybe, sitting somewhere on a completely different side of the world, and they have knowledge that you've never even heard of, and they can actually help you build a better product. So that was step 6. Again, it's important to show success. Okay. So let's talk about the last step, last but not least. It is step 7, building a culture around inner source. So when we talk about inner source, it's essentially building the open source collaboration culture inside your own company and encouraging contributions that look like open source pull request contributions between different teams in your organization. So to understand the value of this, let's take a step back and again look at Microsoft from a few years or decades ago. So if we zoom in on Microsoft in between these charts, this is uncanny for how accurate it is for how different orgs inside of Microsoft actually used to operate. Because there was no incentives for people to actually work together. So if I was building Outlook and you were building Windows, I didn't want to rely on the systems that you build to, say, publish or test software, because then my bonus would be dependent on you maintaining those systems, right? And folks were afraid to rely on one another, because if that's not a priority to me, but it's a priority to you, then I just put my bonus on the line for that. Right? So when Sasha took over, he actually said, I would any day of the week trade off features for our own productivity. So this is kind of an advantage of having the CEO that comes from an engineering background, right? Because he understands that working on internal tools or working on remediating technical debt may have better value to us than working on shiny new features. Right? And so if we take a look at internal numbers, we actually see that this is Microsoft internal only, and this slide doesn't get updated all the time, but roughly 80,000 deployments a day from some environment somewhere in Microsoft, right? So this is including our SaaS tools that were deployed to our customers and stuff like that, right? Roughly 110,000 engineers working with one ES, one engineering system inside of Microsoft, right? So now we're eating our own dog food and leveraging our own tools to build software. So that means that we are becoming our own testers, right? And that also means that we're encouraging that collaboration between different folks inside the company. So basically, if we look at that number, 110,000 engineers working with one engineering system, if we save them just a second per day, then it would be like adding almost 4 people to the company. If we save them a minute a day, then it would be like adding 163 people to Microsoft. And if we save them 1 hour per day, that would be like 2.7 billion in revenue. Now, this is not the numbers that you should evaluate your engineers based upon, right? But this is numbers that are very useful if you're trying to sell your executive leadership on the value of inner source, on the value of collaboration, on the value of investing in internal tools. That is very helpful. So if we look at stats from inside Microsoft, and we look at the breakdown of how many commits, how many pull requests come from a particular source, we see that 90% of pull requests still originate from the same team, right? But then there's 9% of pull requests that originate from a nearby team, and then 1% of requests actually comes from some distant team inside of Microsoft. So imagine a situation where you're building software and you say, rely on an API built by another team. Right? If they have a good documentation for how their process works, you can now contribute to that API. So let's say there's a feature that is blocking you from delivering value to your customers. Well, now you can go and write that particular fix or that particular feature instead of waiting for that team and trying to escalate the importance of it. And it passes all the tests, it passes all the same code reviews, and it kind of integrates in the same process that a normal contribution from that team would be integrated. And sometimes what we see is when you come from a culture where there's not a lot of collaboration, it is hard to build a culture where people actually work together, right? This is another quote that I like, which is, the trouble with incentives is that they work. Right? So if you come to me and say, hi, in our organization, we really encourage collaboration and teamwork, but what we see in reality is that people keep competing with one another. Well, actually, usually, if we look closely, then we see that HR system and rewards are actually built to incentivize competition and not collaboration. So in particular at Microsoft, to encourage the behavior that we wanted to see, we had to rebuild our incentive structure. So instead of it being just the work that you contributed to the company, like, look at me, I built this new test framework or something like that, right? You now had to see, in addition to that, what did you do to contribute to the work of others to allow them to succeed, right? And what did you do by relying on work of others, so collaborating on projects across the company? And we saw that it created a lot more incentives for collaboration, a lot more executive buy-in that was supporting people getting rewarded for the right kind of behavior, and it allowed us to create much more positive impact across the company. And we know that it works because if we look at, for instance, State of DevOps report from 2019, we know that high performers in an industry are actually creating internal structures that create community structures at both low and high level in the organization. So essentially, that internal collaboration allows the entire company to succeed. And then we know that it is actually happening across the industry. It is not just Microsoft. It is many of the big companies out there who are recognizing the value of inner source and starting to build those collaboration tools and those collaboration incentives into their daily life. So this was the 7 steps on your journey to open source in your company. So hopefully this was helpful, and it kind of gets you started on how to think about working with open source and open sourcing your own products. And it's not just about me. It's not just about any particular person on our team. It's about all of us building software together and the entire community benefiting from that process. So to finish, I would like to wish you all to stay safe. And you can find me on Twitter and on GitHub as DivineOps. And I do hope that maybe next year we can meet in person. So thank you so much. До свидания.